The deed hit the judge's table with a sound like a gunshot, and every soul in that Laramie courthouse went dead silent. Anna Hart stood 3 feet away from the woman who had haunted her nightmares for 11 months, watching with her heart hammering so hard she could feel it in her back teeth. As Judge Harlan Prescott unfolded the document with the slow, deliberate care of a man who understood that the paper in his hands could unmake a life. The woman standing on the other side of that table was Vera Caine, and she wore a smile that belonged on a rattlesnake. Vera's silk dress was wrong for Laramie, too city, too deliberate, every inch of it chosen to remind everyone in that room that she came from somewhere with money and the lawyers who fed off it. Anna's hands were clasped in front of her so tightly that her knuckles had gone the color of old bone. The Ridgeline Ranch, 140 acres of Wyoming grassland that her late husband Thomas Hart had broken his body building across 6 brutal years. The place where her son Eli had taken his first steps across a plankboard floor. The place where she had buried Thomas not yet 2 years ago and stood at his grave in the February cold and promised herself she would hold on all of it was written on that deed. All of it now belonged to Vera Caine, if the judge's hammer came down on the wrong side of justice. "Your Honor," Vera's lawyer began, a slick-haired man named Aldous Fitch who smelled of pomade and bad intentions. "The instrument before you represents a legal transfer of property executed by Thomas Hart in the calendar year of 1878, some 14 months before his death. The signature is his. The witnesses are named. The widow's claim to this land is, with respect, entirely without standing." Anna heard a sound beside her. A low, controlled exhale, the kind a man makes when he is choosing very deliberately not to raise his voice. Bernard Merritt stepped forward. He was not Anna's lawyer. He was not a man who wore a suit or carried a briefcase or knew Latin phrases off the top of his head. He was a cattle rancher, broad-shouldered, with sun-darkened skin and hands that had thrown rope and mended fence and pulled calves into the world in driving rain. He was 31 years old, and he had ridden 60 miles in the dark to be standing in this courthouse, and he smelled of horse and dust and something underneath all that, something that was just Bernard that Anna had started noticing in ways that frightened her. He reached across the table. He picked up Vera Caine's deed. And with both hands, slowly, with complete and terrible certainty, Bernard Merritt tore it clean in half. The sound was enormous in that silent room. Vera Caine's face went white, then red, then something that was not a color at all but a species of fury. Judge Prescott lunged forward. Aldous Fitch made a noise like a scalded cat. 2 of the county clerk's deputies stepped away from the wall. "Mr. Merritt," Judge Prescott said, in a voice that could have stripped paint, "you had better have an explanation for that." Bernard set both halves of the deed on the table. He looked at the judge with the calm of a man who has already accepted every consequence and moved past them. "I have more than an explanation, Your Honor," he said. "I have the truth. And if you'll give me 30 minutes, I will show this court exactly what kind of trap Anna Hart has been living inside, and who built it, and why." 11 months earlier, Anna Hart had not known Bernard Merritt's name. She had been standing in the doorway of Thomas's feed store, the one she had kept running after his passing because there was no other choice, tallying the week's accounts on a slate board and trying not to think about how many weeks the numbers were going in the wrong direction. It was June of 1879. The grass along Laramie's main road gone blonde and dry with early summer heat, the air carrying the smell of horse and dust, and the charcoal smoke from the smithy at the end of the block. She was 27. She was a widow with a 5-year-old son and a ranch and a store that were both slowly bleeding money, and she was so tired that some mornings it took her a full minute of standing at the edge of her bed to remember why she was supposed to get up. The man who walked through her door was a stranger, tall, dark-haired, with a hat that had been around since better days and a quiet way of moving that made her think he had learned in his life not to announce himself more than necessary. "Morning," he said. "I'm looking to buy 50 pounds of oats and a block of salt if you have them." "I have them," Anna said. She wrote out the ticket, named the price. He paid it without discussion, which she appreciated. While she helped one of her part-time hands, a 15-year-old named Pete, load the sacks onto the man's wagon, the stranger noticed the fence repair she had been putting off along the western side of the store lot. "That post is gone completely," he said, not critically, just observationally. "I know it," Anna said. "I'm Bernard Merritt. I run the Copper Cross spread about 8 miles east. I've got a crew going by end of this week for my own fencing. I could have one of my men stop and fix that. Wouldn't take an hour." Anna looked at him with the careful, measured distrust of a woman who had learned that offers of help in a small town often came with ledgers attached. "What would you want for that?" Bernard seemed genuinely confused by the question. "Nothing, ma'am. I just want the post fixed before someone's horse walks through it." She told him she would think about it. He nodded, loaded the last of his goods, and drove his wagon east without pressing her further. Anna thought about it for 3 days before she admitted to herself that she needed the help more than she needed her pride, and she sent Pete out to the Copper Cross with a note. Bernard's man came on a Friday and spent 40 minutes replacing the post and restringing the line and took nothing for the work, which bothered Anna more than a bill would have, because she did not know what to do with a kindness she had not earned and could not repay. Bernard came back to the store 2 weeks later for more feed. He did not mention the fence. He asked about the grade of her oat stock and whether she had been getting good quality from her distributor out of Cheyenne. She told him the distributor had been short-weighing her for 3 months and she had not yet found an alternative. "I use a man in Rock Creek," Bernard said. "Honest scales. I'll send you his address if you'd like." She told him she would appreciate that. He sent the address. She wrote to the man in Rock Creek, and the first delivery that came back weighed true to the pound. That was how it started. Not with any great feeling, not with anything that resembled the rushing, dramatic thing she had read about in the novels her mother had sent her from St. Louis. It started with a fence post and an honest grain distributor, and a series of transactions that were simple and clear and fair, which was more than most things in her life had been lately. By August, Bernard was coming by the store once a week, sometimes twice. By September, he had started arriving on Tuesday morning specifically, which happened to be the day Anna brought Eli to the store with her because his lessons with Mrs. Comstock only ran Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. Eli was 5 years old and fiercely opinionated about horses. Bernard, it turned out, had extensive opinions about horses as well, and the two of them developed a routine that Anna watched with something complicated sitting in her chest, the sight of her serious, fatherless little boy standing on the lowest fence rail, and listening with absolute concentration as Bernard explained why a horse's eyes told you more than its legs ever could. "He's a good boy," Bernard said once, when Eli had gone inside to find Pete and show off a grasshopper he had caught. "He is," Anna agreed. They stood for a moment in the comfortable quiet that had been building between them since June, and Anna was aware that it was a different kind of quiet than she usually experienced. Most quiet felt like something missing. This one felt like something there. She did not say that to him. She was not ready to say anything like that to anyone. In October, things began to go wrong. The first sign was the stranger who came to the store asking questions about the deed to the Ridgeline Ranch. He introduced himself as a property assessor from the county, which might have been true except that he arrived on a Saturday when the county office would have been closed, and he wrote nothing down. And when Anna asked for his name a second time, he gave a different one than he had the first time. She told Bernard about it on his next Tuesday visit. She watched his expression shift in a way she had not seen before, a careful, focused stillness that reminded her of a hunting dog that had caught a scent. "What did he look like?" Bernard asked. She described him. Bernard's jaw tightened. "Did he give you any papers, ask you to sign anything?" "No. He just asked who held the original deed, where it was kept, who had witnessed the transaction." Bernard was quiet for a moment. "Anna, do you know a woman named Vera Caine?" The name hit her like cold water. She did know it or knew of it. Thomas had mentioned Vera Caine once, about a year before he died. In the distracted, guilty way he sometimes mentioned things he wished he had not had to mention. She had been a business associate of his, he said, from before. He had not explained what before meant, and Anna had not pushed, because there had been other pressures that week, and she had filed the name away and not returned to it. "I know the name," she said carefully. Bernard pulled a chair from the wall and sat down. He leaned forward, elbows on knees, and looked at her directly, the way he always did when he was about to say something he thought was going to be uncomfortable. "I need to tell you something I heard last month in Cheyenne. I didn't say anything sooner because I wasn't sure it was solid enough to bring to you, but this man asking about the deed changes things." He told her what he knew. Vera Caine was a woman of considerable resources and a legal history that stretched from Denver to Abilene. She had a reputation for identifying properties with unclear or contested ownership and moving through legal channels to secure them for herself, usually using a lawyer named Aldous Fitch, who was apparently so skilled at finding and exploiting irregularities in property documentation that several counties had quietly put him on a watch list without ever being able to formally charge him. Anna listened to all of this with a feeling like the floor tilting beneath her feet. "Do you know if Thomas ever had any dealings with her?" Bernard asked. His voice was careful, not accusatory, not pitying, just clear. "He mentioned her name once," Anna said. "He said she was a business associate." "He didn't explain further and I didn't ask." Bernard nodded. "I think we need to go through every piece of documentation you have on the ranch, every deed, every transfer record, every receipt. If there's something in there that Fitch can use, we need to find it before he does." She almost said something then, something about the fact that this was not his problem to solve, that she had been managing her own problems for nearly 2 years without help, that she did not want to be a weight on someone who was already carrying the responsibilities of his own spread. She stopped herself. Not because she was a woman who swallowed her pride as a matter of course, but because she looked at Bernard Merritt's face and understood that he was not offering to help her out of any condescending notion that she could not manage her own affairs. He was offering because it mattered to him, because she mattered to him. That was a harder thing to look at than any legal document. "All right," she said. "Come by the ranch on Saturday. The files are in Thomas's study." He came on Saturday morning with a tin of coffee his housekeeper had packed, and a calm that made the small, cluttered study feel less like a place full of a dead man's handwriting and more like a room where two people were working on a problem together. They went through everything. Deed of sale from the Territorial Land Office, dated 1873. Transfer of cattle inventory, 1875. Water rights agreement, 1876. Construction permits, mortgage documentation from the Laramie Territorial Bank. It was Bernard who found it. It was buried in a file of miscellaneous correspondence from 1878, in an envelope with no addressee, a single sheet of paper that bore the heading of a Denver property firm, and at the bottom, what appeared to be Thomas Hart's signature on an agreement that described the Ridgeline Ranch in a series of legal particulars and assigned a right of first purchase to a named third party in the event of the primary owner's decease or voluntary relinquishment. The named third party was Vera Caine. Anna read the document 3 times. The world did not change between readings. The sunlight through the study window stayed exactly where it was. Eli's voice came through from the front porch where he was talking to the barn cat. Everything was exactly the same and completely different. "Is it real?" she asked. Her voice came out steady, which surprised her. Bernard held the document up to the window and looked at it for a long time. "The signature looks like his, but there's something wrong with the witness names. Look here." He pointed to 2 names written below Thomas's signature. These names were added after. The ink is a different color and the hand slants differently. Someone added the witnesses after the fact. Can you prove that? I don't know yet, but a good document examiner can. Anna took the paper from him and held it and felt a slow, building anger that was cleaner than grief and sharper than fear. Thomas had been a good man in most of the ways that counted, but he had also been a man with secrets he kept poorly and debts he managed badly, and she had loved him anyway, and he had died anyway. And now whatever mistake or coercion or desperate bargain he had made with Vera Caine was reaching past his grave to take everything he had built. "She's going to come here," Anna said. "She's going to come and she's going to file that document and she is going to try to take my home." "Yes," Bernard said. He did not soften it or dress it up. "That's what I think she's planning. Then I need to be ready." "We need to be ready," he said, quietly and without any particular drama, and that word, the simple enormity of that first-person plural, moved through Anna like the first warm day after a long winter. She did not show it. She was not a woman who showed things easily, but she felt it. They began to prepare. Bernard knew enough about property law in Wyoming territory to know that they needed a lawyer and a document examiner, and they needed them before Vera Caine moved. He rode to Cheyenne the following week, a full day's trip each way, and came back with a name: Margaret Holloway, a woman who had been a legal clerk for 15 years before the law had begun to admit women to practice in certain territories, and who now operated as a paralegal specialist with a reputation for forensic document work that was respected even by the men who resented her gender. Anna wrote to Margaret Holloway that same afternoon. The response came back within the week. Margaret would come to Laramie, examine the documents, and render an opinion. Her fee was reasonable and her discretion absolute. While they waited for Margaret, Anna kept the store running and Bernard kept coming by on Tuesdays, and something was changing between them in a way that was slow and almost imperceptible but entirely real, like a river changing course, which happens so gradually you don't notice until you look back and realize the water is somewhere it wasn't before. He made her laugh on a Tuesday afternoon in November. She could not afterward remember what he said, only that it was unexpected, dry, and perfectly timed, and that the sound she made in response surprised her so much that she covered her mouth with her hand, as if the laugh had escaped before she gave it permission. Bernard looked at her when she did that, just looked at her with an expression she was not ready to name. "You don't do that enough," he said. "Laugh," she said. "Yes," he said simply, and went back to inspecting the sack of grain he had been examining as if he had just commented on the weather. Anna went very still and very warm and turned away before he could see her face. Eli had begun calling him Mr. Bernard by October, and by November he had dropped the Mr., which was either a sign of disrespect or profound comfort. And given that Eli used the same shortened address for Anna's sister Dora, who was one of the 3 people Eli loved most in the world, Anna decided it was the latter. Margaret Holloway arrived in Laramie on a Thursday in late November, a small, precise woman of about 50 with wire-rimmed spectacles, and a traveling case full of magnifying lenses and chemical reagents that she carried as carefully as a surgeon carried his tools. She spent 2 days at Anna's ranch house with the documents spread across Thomas's study table, and on the morning of the 3rd day, she sat down across from Anna and Bernard and gave them her findings. The right of first purchase agreement was genuine. Thomas Hart had signed it. He had signed it in early 1878, approximately 16 months before his death, and the signature was absolutely his. The witness names, however, were fraudulent. Margaret could demonstrate with chemical analysis of the ink that the witness signatures had been added at least 18 months after the document was first created, meaning they had been added after Thomas was already dead. The document, as presented, was therefore a legally incomplete instrument, because witnesses must be present at the time of execution, and anyone claiming otherwise would need to produce the living witnesses, who did not exist, or explain how 2 people had signed a document 18 months before the ink was chemically possible. It was not a complete victory. The right of first purchase itself was real, which meant that even without the witnesses, Vera Caine might have a colorable claim to the property under territorial property law. But the fraudulent witnesses were enough to challenge the document's validity, and enough to demand a full hearing before a judge. "She'll file anyway," Margaret said. "Fitch will argue that the original instrument is valid even without proper witnesses, and he'll cite precedent, but I can counter it. And there's more." She opened a second folder. "While I was examining the miscellaneous correspondence files, I found something you may have missed. There are 3 letters in Thomas Hart's handwriting that were never sent. They are addressed to a property attorney in Denver, and they describe a coercive arrangement. In brief, Thomas writes that he signed the right of purchase agreement under duress because Vera Caine held a debt note against him that she threatened to call in publicly unless he cooperated. He says explicitly that he signed under threat and did not believe the arrangement to be lawful." Anna read the letters. They were in Thomas's hand, his slightly cramped, leftward-tilting script that she knew as well as her own face. He described being approached by Vera Caine in Denver in the spring of 1878, where he had gone to discuss a cattle sale. He described a debt that had accrued through a failed business venture he had never told Anna about. He described Vera's offer, which was not really an offer but a demand. Sign the agreement or the debt would be called in publicly, and the bank would foreclose on the ranch mortgage. He described his shame. He described his intention to find a way to correct it. He had never sent the letters because he had died before he found the way. Anna sat with those letters for a long time. The grief in them was old and specific and belonged to a version of her husband she had not known, a man who had made a bad choice in a desperate moment and spent the time he had left trying to undo it in secret. She mourned that man for a little while, quietly, inside herself. Then she set the letters down and looked at Bernard. "Coercion," she said. "That's a defense." "It's more than a defense," Bernard said. "If we can demonstrate that Thomas was coerced, the agreement is void from the moment of signing. Void, not just contested." "We need a lawyer," Anna said. "A real one for the hearing." "I know one in Cheyenne," Bernard said. "His name is Garrett Webb. He's the best property attorney in the territory, and he owes me a favor I've never collected." "You've been saving that favor." Bernard looked at her steadily. "I wasn't saving it for anything in particular, but this seems like the right moment to spend it." Anna held his gaze for a count of 3. Something passed between them in that silence, something that was not words and did not need to be, and Anna looked away first not because she was afraid of it, but because she needed a moment to carry it. They sent for Garrett Webb. He arrived in December, riding into Laramie on a gray horse, a compact man of 45 with a precisely trimmed beard, and the unhurried manner of someone who had stood before enough judges that courtrooms held no particular terror for him. He reviewed Margaret's findings and Thomas's unsent letters and the original deed, and the fraudulent witnesses, and spent a full morning asking Anna questions with the methodical thoroughness of a man who did not miss things. At the end of it, he said, "Vera Caine is going to file. When she does, we'll have the hearing scheduled within 30 days. Here is what you need to understand. The forensic evidence is strong but not ironclad. The coercion argument is strong but depends on letters that were never sent and therefore never formally attested. What we need, ideally, is a living witness who can corroborate the coercion." "Do you know of anyone?" Anna asked. "Not yet," Garrett said, "but I intend to look." He looked for 3 weeks, and in the first week of January he found one. The witness's name was Roland Finch, and he had been the clerk at the Denver hotel where Thomas Hart and Vera Caine had met in the spring of 1878. He was a quiet, bespectacled man of 52 who had left Denver the previous year and was now working as a bookkeeper in Rock Creek. He remembered the meeting because Vera Caine was not the kind of woman anyone forgot, and because what he had overheard from the hallway outside the private dining room had troubled him enough to mention it to a colleague at the time. The colleague was no longer living, but Roland Finch was, and he remembered, and when Garrett Webb explained the situation to him carefully and completely, Roland Finch agreed to testify. Anna wept when she heard that, not in front of anyone. She went to the barn and stood with her forehead against the neck of her dappled gray mare and cried until the shaking stopped, and then she washed her face at the pump and went back inside to make supper. Vera Caine filed her claim on the 15th of January, 1880. The hearing was scheduled for the 4th of February at the Laramie County Courthouse before Judge Harlan Prescott, a man of 62 with a reputation for rigorous adherence to law and a documented disdain for legal manipulation. Anna told herself she was prepared. She was not entirely wrong. What she was not prepared for was the 3 weeks between the filing and the hearing, during which Vera Caine turned up in Laramie in person and made it her business to be visible. She took a room at the Grand Territorial Hotel, the nicest establishment in Laramie, and she wore expensive clothes, and she visited the bank and the county clerk's office and the post office, and she spoke to people at social events that Anna also sometimes attended, and she did all of this with the quiet, deliberate efficiency of someone who wanted everyone in town to understand that she was serious and she was staying. She came to the store once, just once, on a Tuesday morning in late January, which was, of course, the day Bernard was always there. Anna was behind the counter when the bell over the door rang. She looked up. Vera Caine walked in with the same smile she would later wear in the courthouse, the rattlesnake smile, and she looked around the store with an expression of polite contempt and then looked at Anna. "Mrs. Hart," she said, "I thought we should meet properly since we've been in such close proximity through Thomas's affairs." "You can say what you need to say and leave," Anna said. Her voice was level. She was proud of that. "I'm not here to quarrel," Vera said. "I'm here because I think there may be a way to resolve this without the unpleasantness of a full hearing. If you were to sign over a portion of the ranch, the eastern 40 acres, say, and acknowledge the instrument's validity in principle, I would be willing to walk away from the remaining 100 acres and let you keep the house and the store." Anna looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said. Vera's smile did not waver. "You should think carefully. Fitch is very good." "You should think carefully," Anna said. "I have very good people of my own." It was at this point that Bernard came through the back of the store from the yard where he had been helping Pete with a delivery. He stopped when he saw Vera. He did not say anything. He just stood there, big and quiet and very still, and he looked at Vera Caine with an expression that was not threatening in any way that could be described or acted upon but was absolutely unambiguous. Vera looked at him. She looked at Anna. The smile thinned slightly at the edges. "I'll see you at the hearing, Mrs. Hart," she said and left. The bell over the door rang as it closed. Bernard stood where he was for a moment. "Are you all right?" "Yes," Anna said. She was surprised to find it was true. He crossed the room and stood on the other side of the counter. He was close enough that she could see the pattern of silver that had been working its way into the hair at his temples since she had first met him in June. She had been noticing his face for months, storing details with a precision she refused to examine too closely. "She offered you a portion," he asked. "Eastern 40 acres and acknowledgement of the instrument." I told her no. "Good," he said simply. "Bernard," she said before she could stop herself. "Why are you doing this?" "I don't mean the lawyer and the document examiner, I mean all of it. The Tuesdays and the fence post and the all of it." He looked at her without surprise, as if he had been expecting the question for some time. "Because I want to," he said, "and because I think you deserve someone who wants to." It was a simple thing to say. It undid her entirely. She pressed her lips together and looked at the counter surface and said nothing for a full 10 seconds, and Bernard waited without filling the silence, which was one of the things she had come to understand about him. He did not fill silences with sound just to relieve his own discomfort. "I'm not ready," she said finally. "I don't know when I will be. I need you to know that." "I know it," he said. "I'm not going anywhere." She looked up at him then, and whatever was in her face was enough that his expression shifted into something gentle and certain and patient, and he went back to the business of the day without another word about it. That was, she would think later when she fell in love with him, Not in any single dramatic moment, but in the accumulation of 100 small ones, and that one most of all. The night before the hearing, Anna could not sleep. She lay in the dark listening to the February wind push against the house and thought about Thomas, about the man she had loved and buried, and about Bernard, about the man she was trying very carefully not to love because loving again required a courage she was not sure she possessed. She thought about Eli asleep in his room, about what it would mean to him to lose this place, the only home he had ever known, the land where his father was buried. She got up at 4 in the morning and went to the kitchen and lit the lamp and sat at the table. She had been sitting there for perhaps 20 minutes when she heard hooves in the yard. She went to the window. Bernard's horse was at the hitching post. She watched him dismount in the dark, moving with that quiet certainty of his, and she thought, he rode here in the middle of the night because he knew I wouldn't be sleeping. She opened the door before he could knock. He stood on the porch in the February cold with his coat collar up and his breath making clouds in the dark air, and he looked at her and said, "You doing all right?" "No," she said. It was the most honest answer she had given anyone in months. "Do you want company?" "Yes," she said, which was the second most honest answer she had given anyone in months. He came inside. She made coffee. They sat at the kitchen table, and they talked about very little that had anything to do with the hearing. He told her about a horse he had bought in November that had turned out to have a trick of opening latches, and how he had come out one morning to find every gate in the Copper Cross barn standing open, and his entire remuda grazing peacefully in his housekeeper's kitchen garden. She laughed at that, the real kind of laugh that she had begun to feel less guilty about. He told her about the winter he had spent in Montana before he came to Wyoming, and she told him about the summer her family had spent traveling from Indiana to Laramie when she was 12, and about how she had stood on a ridge above the territory and looked at the grass stretching away in every direction and felt something resolve in her chest, some deep insistence that this was where she was supposed to be. "I felt that when I came to Wyoming," he said, "like the land was already expecting me." "Yes," she said, "exactly like that." They sat in comfortable quiet for a while, and at some point Anna realized that the fear in her chest had not disappeared but had changed its shape, had become something more manageable, more contained. She was still afraid of tomorrow, but she did not feel alone in it. "I need to tell you something," she said. She looked at her coffee cup. "About what you said in the store, about wanting someone to want to." He waited. "I think I'm getting ready," she said. "I don't know exactly when. But I think I'm getting there." The silence lasted long enough that she looked up. He was looking at her with an expression she had never quite seen on him before, or had not let herself see before, and it was so clear and so full that it made her throat tighten. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll be here." They sat until the sky outside the kitchen window began to gray toward dawn, and then Bernard went out to see to his horse, and Anna went to wake Eli and dress for court. The hearing convened at 9 o'clock in the morning. The Laramie County Courthouse was a modest building of dark brick, with wooden benches inside that held perhaps 40 people, and every one of those benches was full. News traveled fast in a town of 2,000, and the story of the widow's rival and the contested deed had been circulating for weeks. Anna sat at the plaintiff's table with Garrett Webb. Bernard sat in the first row of the gallery, directly behind her, close enough that she could feel the steadiness of his presence like a hand at her back. Vera Caine sat at the opposing table with Aldous Fitch, in her silk dress and her rattlesnake smile. Fitch presented the deed first. He was a skilled speaker, and he laid out his case with the particular kind of elegant confidence that made complicated things sound inevitable. The right of purchase agreement was valid. The signature was Thomas Hart's. The witnesses were on record. The instrument had been executed lawfully, and the widow's occupation of the property since her husband's death was therefore technically in contravention of a prior legal agreement. He cited 3 territorial precedents that Garrett had anticipated and prepared for. Garrett rose and addressed each precedent with a precision that made Anna breathe slightly easier. He introduced Margaret Holloway's forensic analysis of the witness signatures. Margaret herself took the stand and explained, in terms that were technical but comprehensible, exactly how she had determined that the witness ink had been applied after the original document's creation and after the death of Thomas Hart. Fitch cross-examined Margaret with everything he had. She did not budge. Garrett then introduced Thomas's unsent letters. He read them into the record in full, and the courtroom was very quiet during the reading because Thomas Hart's voice came through those letters in a way that was unmistakable. His shame, his explanation of the coercion, his intention to correct it. Fitch objected. The letters were hearsay. They were the words of a dead man, unsworn, unattested. They should be excluded. Judge Prescott considered. He looked at the letters. He looked at Fitch. He said that he would hear argument on admissibility before ruling, and that he would also hear from the live witness Garrett had identified. Roland Finch took the stand. He described the meeting at the Denver Hotel in the spring of 1878. He described what he had overheard from the hallway. He described the raised voices, the specific phrase he had caught through the door, which was Vera Caine's voice saying something that Roland had never forgotten because of its cold clarity. "If you do not sign tonight, your family will have nothing by spring." The courtroom reacted to that. Judge Prescott called for silence. Fitch's cross-examination of Roland Finch was aggressive and skillful, but Roland Finch was a bookkeeper, and his memory for details was better than his nerves suggested, and he held through all of it without material contradiction. Then Fitch pulled a second document from his case. Anna had not seen it before. Garrett had not seen it before. It was a deed of transfer, not a right of first purchase but an outright deed of transfer, naming Vera Caine as full and absolute owner of the Ridgeline Ranch, and signed, apparently, by Thomas Hart with 4 witnesses, all dated to December of 1878. Anna felt the courtroom change around her. She heard the murmurs. Fitch presented the document with a satisfied deliberateness that made Anna's stomach turn over. He explained that this was not a contingent right of purchase, but an absolute transfer, executed by Mr. Hart in December of 1878, which superseded any questions of coercion regarding the earlier document, and which established Ms. Caine's absolute ownership independent of any prior instrument. Garrett was on his feet immediately. He requested the document. The judge allowed it. Garrett examined it quickly and then passed it to the man sitting beside him, a quiet figure who had come into the courtroom after the proceedings began and whom Anna had not paid particular attention to until now. She looked at him. He had a small case open on the bench beside him. He was Margaret Holloway's associate, a document examiner she had sent from Cheyenne as a secondary precaution. Anna waited. The courtroom waited. Fitch looked unconcerned, and it was in this moment, in the suspended breath of it, that Bernard did what he did. He had been sitting in the gallery watching Garrett and the examiner, and he had been watching Fitch and Vera Caine, and something in Fitch's particular brand of self-satisfaction had crossed a line for him that Anna could see from where she sat. She turned in her chair and found him already standing. He walked to the table. He looked at the second deed. He picked it up in both hands. He looked at Vera Caine, who was staring at him with something flickering behind the rattlesnake smile. He looked at Judge Prescott, and he tore the deed in half. The sound was enormous. Everyone reacted. And in the midst of all the reaction, Bernard said it calmly, the thing he had been building toward. "I have more than an explanation, Your Honor. I have the truth. And if you'll give me 30 minutes, I will show this court exactly what kind of trap Anna Hart has been living inside, and who built it, and why." Judge Prescott's voice cut through the noise like a bell. He called for order. He turned to Bernard with an expression that was somewhere between outrage and barely visibly interest. "Mr. Merritt," he said, "you have just destroyed a legal document in this courtroom. You understand that this is a serious matter." "I understand, Your Honor." "I also understand that document was not a legal instrument. It was a fabrication, and I can demonstrate that. I can demonstrate it in approximately 20 minutes if you'll give me the floor." Fitch erupted. He used the word outrage 4 times in 30 seconds. He demanded that Bernard be removed. He demanded the torn pieces be treated as evidence. He demanded a great many things. Judge Prescott raised one hand and the room went quiet. "Mr. Fitch," the judge said, "I will hear what Mr. Merritt has to say. You will have full opportunity to respond. Sit down." He looked at Bernard. "You have 20 minutes, Mr. Merritt. Make them count." Bernard took a breath. He was standing in the middle of the courtroom without notes, without a briefcase, without the particular armor of a man trained in law, and Anna watched him from across the room and thought, "There is no one on this earth I trust more." "Your Honor," Bernard said, "that document was dated December 1878. The paper it was written on, the specific grade and treatment of it, was not produced by any supplier in Wyoming Territory or the state of Colorado until the spring of 1879. My associate here," he nodded to the document examiner, "can attest to that from the fiber analysis he has already conducted in the time since the document was presented." The examiner stood and confirmed it. Bernard continued, "Additionally, 3 of the 4 witnesses named on that document were in a different state in December 1878. I have affidavits here, gathered over the past 2 weeks, from employers and business associates who can place them in Abilene, Kansas at the time of the alleged signing. I sent for these affidavits 2 weeks ago because I had received information suggesting that Aldous Fitch maintains a practice of preparing fraudulent instruments as secondary reinforcement to contested primary documents." He produced the affidavits from his coat pocket. 3 sets of sworn statements, gathered from Kansas by telegraph and express mail, in which the named witnesses confirmed that they were in Abilene in December 1878 and had never set foot in Wyoming and had never met Thomas Hart. He set the affidavits and the torn halves of the deed on the judge's table. He looked at Vera Caine, who was no longer smiling. "This is the second fraudulent document Ms. Caine and Mr. Fitch have presented before this court," Bernard said. "The first was the right of purchase instrument with fabricated witness signatures, which Mrs. Holloway's analysis has already addressed. The second is the deed before you, or what remains of it, which was created on paper that did not exist at the time it was allegedly signed and witnessed by people who were demonstrably elsewhere. This is not a case of contested ownership. This is a case of systematic fraud against a widow who has done nothing except try to hold on to the home she built with her husband." He stopped there. He looked at Judge Prescott and waited. The judge looked at the affidavits. He looked at the document examiner. He looked at the torn halves of the deed. He looked at Aldous Fitch, who was very still and very pale. Then he looked at Vera Caine. "Ms. Caine," the judge said, "do you have anything to say in your own behalf?" Vera Caine looked at the torn deed on the judge's table. She looked at Fitch. She looked at Anna, and there was something in her expression now that was not the rattlesnake smile. That was something harder and smaller, and it might almost have been fear. "I would like to consult with my attorney," she said. "You'll have that opportunity," Judge Prescott said, "in approximately 1 moment. But first I am going to tell this court what I am going to do." He gathered the affidavits and the pieces of the torn deed and set them in a neat stack. He looked at his clerk, then at the gallery. "In 40 years on the bench," he said, "I have seen a great many attempts to use the law as a weapon against those least able to defend themselves. What I have seen in this courtroom today represents 2 separate instances of documented fraud perpetrated against this court and against Mrs. Anna Hart. The forensic evidence regarding the witness signatures on the primary instrument has not been effectively countered. The affidavits presented by Mr. Merritt, if verified, render the secondary instrument fraudulent on its face. I am therefore issuing an immediate ruling that both instruments are void and without legal standing. The Ridgeline Ranch remains the property of Anna Hart." He looked at Fitch. "I am also referring the matter of the fraudulent documents to the Territorial Prosecutor's Office for investigation. Mr. Fitch, you are advised to remain available." He looked at Vera Caine. His expression was not unkind. "Ms. Caine, I don't know how much of this was your doing and how much was your attorney's. That will be for the prosecutor to determine. But I would strongly suggest that you remove yourself from Laramie with some haste and a great deal of reflection." He lifted his gavel and brought it down. The sound of it rang in Anna's ears like something ending and something beginning simultaneously. For a full 5 seconds she did not move. She sat at the plaintiff's table with her hands flat on the surface and breathed slowly, and the room erupted around her. People talking, Fitch gathering his papers with shaking hands, Vera Caine's face doing something complicated and private, Garrett Webb reaching over and pressing her hand briefly in professional satisfaction. Then she turned. Bernard was still standing in the middle of the courtroom with the empty space around him that the moment had created. He was looking at her. He had been looking at her since the gavel came down. She pushed back her chair. She walked across the courtroom. She stopped in front of him, this man who had ridden 60 miles in the dark, who had spent 7 months teaching her son about horses' eyes and replacing fence posts, and never once making her feel like a burden, who had stood in a courthouse and torn a fraudulent deed in half with both hands, and then quietly and methodically produced the evidence to justify it. "Bernard," she said. "Anna," he said. She reached up and put both hands on either side of his face and kissed him. It was not tentative, it was not brief. It was the kiss of a woman who had been getting ready and had now arrived, fully, without reservation, and Bernard's hands came up to hold her in a way that was careful and certain and absolutely present, and the courtroom went either very quiet or very loud. Anna was not sure which, because she was entirely occupied with the business of this moment. When they separated, his forehead came down against hers, and they stood like that for a beat, two people in the wreckage and resolution of a very long morning. "You tore it in half," she said. She could not quite stop a sound that was somewhere between a laugh and a sob. "It was a fraudulent document," he said, with perfect seriousness. "Yes," she agreed, and then she laughed fully and properly, and Bernard smiled, and the room existed again. Eli appeared at her side, having been sitting with Bernard's ranch hand who had accompanied them to court. He was 6 now, with Thomas's dark eyes and Anna's stubbornness, and he looked at his mother and at Bernard with the thorough, unsentimental assessment of a child who had been watching the two of them for months. "Did we win?" Eli asked. "We won," Anna said. Eli looked at Bernard. "Good," he said, with tremendous authority, and went back to the ranch hand to report this news. Bernard looked at Anna. The smile on his face was quiet and contained, the way everything about him was, but his eyes were not contained at all. "Come home," she said. "Both of our homes, I mean. There's supper to make," and she stopped and tried again because this was not a woman who stumbled over words and she was not going to start now. "Will you come for supper? And after supper I would like to talk about what we are to each other if you're willing." "I'm willing," Bernard said. He offered her his arm and she took it, and they walked out of the Laramie County Courthouse into the thin, bright February air of Wyoming. Vera Caine left Laramie that same afternoon. She did not speak to Anna again. Aldous Fitch remained in town for 2 days while the territorial prosecutor's office sent a representative to collect copies of the fraudulent documents, and then he too departed. What followed from the investigation took the better part of a year, and Anna received periodic reports from Garrett Webb. Fitch was disbarred by the spring and faced criminal charges that would occupy the courts for another 2 years. Vera Caine cooperated partially with the investigation in exchange for a reduced exposure that left her financially damaged but not imprisoned, which was either a mercy or an insufficient consequence depending on one's point of view, and Anna found that she spent very little time thinking about it either way. What she spent her time thinking about was considerably more interesting. She and Bernard talked after supper that February evening, a long, careful conversation in which they were both honest about what they wanted and what they feared and what they were willing to try. Bernard said he had been in love with her since August, which was farther back than she had realized, and she said she had been in love with him since the Tuesday he made her laugh, and then said she didn't do it enough, which surprised him because he had not thought he was being particularly revealing that day. They were careful with each other through the winter and into the spring. They were careful because Anna's grief for Thomas, though it had changed its shape, was still real, and because Eli needed to be considered, and because neither of them was a person who moved fast when careful was better. Bernard began joining them for Sunday meals at the ranch. Eli participated in these with the quiet approval of a person whose opinion has been solicited and found to be positive, which for Eli was an extremely high compliment. He showed Bernard where the best fishing was along the creek behind the barn, and Bernard took him along when he went to look at a new foal at a neighboring ranch, which earned Bernard a degree of regard in Eli's estimation that Anna had not previously seen the boy extend to any adult who was not herself. In March, Bernard asked Anna to ride out with him on a Saturday afternoon. He took her east toward the Copper Cross but turned off the main track before they reached it, up a long rise that ended on a bluff overlooking a wide stretch of grassland, the Laramie Plains spreading south and west in the pale winter-end light, snow still caught in the shadowed cuts of the hills. He stopped his horse. She stopped beside him. "I want to ask you something," he said, "and I want you to know that there is no pressure in this question. However you answer it is the right answer, and nothing changes if the answer is not yet or not right now." "All right," she said. "Will you marry me?" he said. "Not because it's practical, not because of the ranch or anything else outside of us. Because I want to spend my life with you and with Eli, and because I think you are the finest person I have ever known, and I would like to try to be worthy of that for the rest of my life." Anna looked at the plains stretching away in every direction, enormous and enduring under the late winter sky. "Yes," she said. "Absolutely yes." She looked at him. He was looking at her with an expression she could read completely now, no part of it withheld, and it was the most extraordinary thing she had ever seen on a human face. He reached across the space between their horses and took her hand and held it. The horses stood on the bluff in the thin, bright air, while the light moved across the Laramie Plains, and neither of them needed to say anything else for a long time. They married in May of 1880 at the Laramie Community Church on a Saturday morning that started with rain and cleared by noon, the way mornings in Wyoming were inclined to do with no regard for ceremony or planning. The church was full. Bernard's housekeeper, a stout and immovable woman named Helen Prout, cried through the entire proceedings and did not attempt to hide it. Margaret Holloway attended and sat in the third row and looked satisfied in the way that people look satisfied when they have contributed to something that has come out right. Garrett Webb sent a letter with a bottle of good brandy. Roland Finch, who had not expected to be invited, received an invitation anyway and came from Rock Creek looking somewhat overwhelmed by the whole business. Eli stood at the front of the church beside Bernard during the ceremony, which was not a formal role but which he had appointed himself to after determining that Bernard should not have to stand there alone, and he held this position with the gravity of a child who understood that important things required witnesses. The vows were simple. Anna had written her own, and she said them clearly, in a voice that did not shake, looking at Bernard's face. She said that she had not expected to love again after a great loss, and that loving again had taught her something she had not known before, that love was not a finite resource that depleted with use, and that the love she had carried for Thomas had not diminished to make room for this love, had instead simply been joined by it, and that she understood her life now as a place large enough to hold both. Bernard listened to this with complete stillness. When she was finished, he said his own vows, which he had also written himself, and which were shorter but no less considered. He said that he would choose her every day. He said that every day was a choice, and he would make it, deliberately and without reservation, for as long as he was alive to make it. The judge who pronounced them married was not Judge Prescott, who had retired to his family in Cheyenne by then, but a younger man named Willis, and he seemed genuinely moved by the proceedings, which Anna found touching. After the ceremony, they had a supper at the Ridgeline Ranch, with half the county in attendance and long tables set up in the yard and Helen Pruitt's cooking, which was the kind of cooking that people brought up in conversation for years afterward. Bernard danced with Anna in the lamplight of the yard, while Pete played fiddle and Eli danced with Helen, who was a better dancer than her build suggested, and the night was warm and the stars came out over Wyoming in their enormous uncountable numbers. Anna stood with Bernard after the dancing and looked up at the stars and felt the weight of the past 2 years, the grief and the fear and the long months of holding on, settle into something that was not gone but was transformed. It was history now. It was the ground they were standing on. "Are you happy?" Bernard asked. She thought about the question with the seriousness it deserved. "Yes," she said. "Genuinely, are you?" "More than I knew how to want to be," he said, "which is a strange thing to discover at 31. "You were a very contained man when I met you," she said. "I was," he agreed. "You opened something up." She leaned her head against his shoulder and they stood under the Wyoming stars until Eli came to find them, having been permitted to stay up considerably past his usual hour, and declared that he was now ready to sleep and expected someone to walk him to his room. Bernard walked him. Anna watched from the porch while the lamplight moved through the window of Eli's room, and she heard Eli's voice and then Bernard's, and then quiet, and then Bernard came back out to the porch. "He wants to know if you're going to have a baby," Bernard reported, with a composure that did not entirely conceal his amusement. Anna felt warmth move up her face. "What did you tell him?" "I told him that was a question for another time and that he should sleep." "That was diplomatic." "I try," he said. She laughed and he put his arm around her and they went inside together. The Copper Cross and the Ridgeline Ranch merged their operations by August, which was a practical decision that took 3 months of detailed planning and resulted in a combined spread of 240 acres that Bernard ran with the systematic competence he brought to everything. Anna kept the feed store in town because she had built it and because it was profitable and because she liked having her own work, and Bernard never once suggested otherwise. Eli started proper school that autumn, riding in with Anna 3 mornings a week on the dappled gray mare, sitting in front of her on the saddle with the focused expression of a person with important places to be. He was adjusting to the change in his household with the particular resilience of a child who has been loved consistently, and therefore trusts the world to remain basically navigable, and his relationship with Bernard was deepening in ways that were quiet and specific and entirely real. He started calling Bernard Pa in October, not formally, not with any announcement. He said it once, quite naturally, in the middle of a sentence about the latch-trick horse, and then he said it again the next day, and by the end of the week it had settled into place as if it had always been there. Bernard mentioned it to Anna once in the evening in the understated way he had when something had moved him more than he wanted to demonstrate. "He said it again today," Bernard told her. "I know," she said. "How do you feel about it?" He was quiet for a moment. "Like I want to be equal to it," he said, "every single day." She reached across the table and covered his hand with hers. In the spring of 1881, Anna told Bernard she was expecting. She told him on a Sunday morning at the kitchen table, with the direct, clear manner in which she approached most things of importance. He was quiet for a moment that was so still she almost asked him if he was all right. And then he looked at her with an expression she had never seen on his face before, a kind of luminous, helpless, wide-open thing that made him look suddenly younger, and he got up from his chair and came around the table and held her with a gentleness that she felt in her bones. "All right?" he asked, his voice against her hair. "All right," she confirmed. He laughed then, quietly and fully, the laugh of a man who has not made a habit of laughing and finds himself ambushed by joy. Eli received the news with the careful deliberation of a 7-year-old assessing a significant development. He asked several practical questions about sleeping arrangements and horse access, and whether the baby would need to use his fishing spot. Anna addressed each concern with equal seriousness. Eli ultimately determined that these were manageable issues and pronounced himself cautiously supportive. The baby came in November, a boy, which surprised approximately no one who had been paying attention to how things tended to go for Anna Hart Merritt. They named him James Thomas Merritt, James for Bernard's father, Thomas for the man who had built the land they were all standing on, and the combination felt right to both of them, a bridge between what had been and what was. James was a loud, sturdy, immensely pleased with himself infant who from the first week of his life demonstrated a personality entirely his own. And Eli, after an initial week of architectural adjustment, appointed himself James's foremost authority and protector, a role he inhabited with the particular focused seriousness that characterized everything he did. Bernard held his son on the second night, after Anna had slept and the house was quiet, sitting in the rocking chair that Helen Prude had brought over from the Copper Cross without being asked, because she was a woman who understood what was needed before anyone had said it. He sat in that chair in the lamplight and held James, and looked at the infant's face with an expression Anna saw from the doorway and carried with her for the rest of her life. She leaned in the doorway and watched. Bernard looked up and saw her. He said nothing. She said nothing. Everything was already said. In the years that followed, the Ridgeline Ranch grew and the Copper Cross grew with it. And Laramie itself grew because the territory was growing, because people kept coming west with their particular combination of desperation and hope, and the land kept receiving them. Anna's store expanded to a second building by 1883, and she hired 3 full-time hands and a manager who freed her to spend more time at the ranch, which she had begun to feel strongly about now that the boys were old enough to require the kind of specific, outdoor, what-is-that-can-I-eat-it education that a ranch uniquely provided. Margaret Holloway came back to Laramie in 1883 to open a permanent practice, having finally secured the formal recognition of her credentials that she had been working toward for a decade. She and Anna became close friends, the kind of friendship that is made between women who have been through something hard together and come out on the right side. Garrett Webb sent Christmas letters. Roland Finch eventually retired from bookkeeping and moved to Laramie proper, where he became something of a known figure at the library, which he visited every Tuesday with the regularity of a natural law. Pete, who had been 15 when Anna first hired him, grew up to be a reliable and skilled ranch hand who stayed on the combine spread into adulthood and eventually became Bernard's foreman. His knowledge of horses turned out to be considerable, and he and Eli had a professional regard for each other that developed from the easy friendship of their childhood into something more structured and mutually respectful. In 1885, Anna told Bernard she was expecting again. This time he already knew, the way he had begun to know things about her that she had not said, the particular awareness that came from 5 years of paying close attention to one person. "I thought so," he said. "Don't be smug about it," she said. He smiled, which was answer enough. The second child was a girl, arrived in the summer of 1885 with Thomas's dark eyes and Bernard's calm, and they named her Clara Elizabeth Merritt, and James, who was 4 by then and had long since concluded that the world contained exactly as much of himself as it needed, accepted his sister with an equanimity that suggested he had decided to find this development acceptable. Eli, now 11 and possessed of the focused seriousness of a young man who took responsibilities genuinely to heart, informed his parents that he intended to be very good at being Clara's brother, which he then set about demonstrating with a thoroughness that made Anna's chest ache with love for him on a daily basis. By 1887, the Merritt spread was one of the most productive in Laramie County, and Bernard had a reputation as a man whose word was worth more than most men's contracts, and Anna had a reputation as a woman who could read a business ledger and a horizon with equal accuracy, which was considered unusual and was considered increasingly admirable as the decade progressed and the territory moved closer to statehood. Anna sat on the porch one September evening in 1887, watching the light go out of the sky over Wyoming in the particular way it had, the colors moving through gold to rose to purple to the first deep blue of evening, the kind of sky that reminded her why she had stood on a ridge at age 12 and felt the land already claiming her. Bernard came out and sat beside her. They had a habit of sitting here in the evenings, after supper and after the children were accounted for and the day's work was done, just sitting and being together in the quiet that had always been their native language. James was inside with Eli, the two of them working on something with rope that was probably inadvisable, but had been approved on the grounds that it was better to be inadvisable with supervision than without. Clara was in Bernard's lap within 3 minutes of him sitting down, because she had a talent for appearing wherever Bernard was that had made Eli call her a shadow with opinions. Anna looked at her daughter in her husband's arms, at the darkening sky above the land they had held together, at the grass moving in the September wind. She thought about the courthouse in February of 1880, the sound of a deed tearing in half, the absolute certainty with which Bernard had done it. She thought about all the things that had tried to take this from her and all the things that had helped her hold it and the particular extraordinary fact of the man sitting beside her who had ridden 60 miles in the dark because he knew she would not be sleeping. "What are you thinking about?" Bernard asked. "February," she said. He knew which February she meant. He always knew. "I would do it again," he said simply. "Tear up a legal document in front of a judge." "Every time," he said without hesitation. She laughed, and the laugh went out into the Wyoming evening and was absorbed by it, and Clara looked up at the sound with the expression of a 2-year-old who is pleased that the adults are happy. Inside the house, Eli's voice and James's voice rose briefly in what sounded like a disagreement about the rope project, and then settled, and Bernard and Anna did not move from where they were because the equilibrium had restored itself as equilibria between children usually did. The stars began to come out. Bernard reached over and took Anna's hand the way he had on the bluff in March of 1880, with the same quiet certainty, and she held it the way she had then. The Laramie plain stretched away in every direction, enormous and enduring, receiving the night in its slow and ancient way. Anna Hart Merritt sat on the porch of her home, which was hers, which had been fought for and won and built further, which held her children and her husband, and the accumulation of a life she had not planned and could not have imagined from the other side of loss. And she felt, in the marrow of her, the deep and specific happiness of a person who has come through something hard and arrived somewhere real. "Another year," she said quietly, not to Bernard in particular, just to the evening, just to Wyoming, just to time itself. "Another year," he agreed. They sat until the stars were fully out and the house was quiet inside and the September wind had gone still, and the night was enormous and full and entirely theirs. In the summer of 1889, Wyoming was admitted to the Union as the 44th state, the first state in the nation to grant women the right to vote, which had in fact been the case in the territory since 1869, a fact Anna had always considered one of the better ideas the West had produced. Laramie celebrated with a week of events and considerable noise, and the Merritt family attended most of them, Bernard and Anna walking through the bunting-decorated Main Street with Clara on Bernard's shoulders and James and Eli flanking them, the 5 of them moving through the celebration with the ease of people who are entirely comfortable in their own lives and in each other's company. In 1890, Anna discovered she was expecting for the 3rd time, which she greeted with a combination of joy and resigned amusement that Bernard found deeply endearing. Their 3rd child was born in the spring of 1891, another boy, delivered with the same unhurried efficiency that characterized most of what Anna did, and they named him Robert Henry Merritt, and he entered the family with the absolute confidence of a youngest child who has never been required to compete for anything, and has therefore decided that the world is a friendly place. Robert was, from infancy, a person of sunny disposition and limitless curiosity, which meant that by the time he was 2, he had investigated every corner of the ranch that he was theoretically not allowed to access, and had been retrieved from various inadvisable locations by his siblings so often that Eli and James had developed a retrieval system with assigned zones of responsibility, which Clara supervised with a managerial precision that startled everyone, including Bernard. By the early 1890s, the Merritt family had become one of those Wyoming households that other people measured their own lives against, not because it was perfect or effortless, because it was neither, but because it had the quality of being genuinely itself, fully inhabited by the people living it. Visitors came and felt the particular warmth of a house where people were actually glad to be together. Anna still ran the store, which by 1893 had grown into a full supply merchant operation employing 6 people year-round. She had taken on a business partnership with Margaret Holloway for a separate venture, a women's cooperative that pooled purchasing power for several ranching families in the county, which was considered progressive by some and eminently sensible by most. Bernard ran the ranch with Pete and a crew that had grown to 12 hands at peak season, and he had acquired a modest reputation in Wyoming and beyond as a man who bred good horses, Thomas's dappled gray mare having turned out to be the beginning of a line of horses that were sold across 3 territories and into Colorado. Eli had inherited his love of horses comprehensively, and by 17 was working the breeding program with Bernard with the focused expertise of a young man who has found exactly what he is supposed to do. In the evenings, Bernard and Anna still sat on the porch. They had sat on this porch through Wyoming winters and Wyoming summers, through good years and hard ones, through the ordinary daily texture of a life being lived fully. They had sat here in the years when the children were small, and the nights were interrupted, and the exhaustion was real but underlaid always with something more durable than tiredness. They had sat here in the years when the children began to move toward their own lives, Eli becoming a young man, James not far behind, Clara developing into a person with her own fierce intelligence, Robert growing up in the easy sunshine of a family that had found its steady ground. On an evening in the autumn of 1894, Bernard and Anna sat on the porch as they always had, and the light was going out of the sky in the old way, and the land was all around them, theirs and enduring. Anna was 42, Bernard was 46, they had been married 14 years. Eli was 20, James was 12, Clara was 9, Robert was 3. The ranch was good, the store was good, the family was good. "I thought once," Anna said, "that I might not survive losing the ranch. I thought the ground was going out from under me and I would just fall." "I know," Bernard said, "and then you tore that deed in half." "It was a fraudulent document," he said, which was what he always said when she mentioned it. "It was a fraudulent document," she agreed, "and you tore it in half and said you had the truth, and I believed you completely. Because I did have it." "Yes," she said. "But also because you said it like someone who had been telling the truth his whole life and was not about to stop." Bernard looked at her in the late autumn light, the way he had been looking at her for 15 years, with that complete and unhurried attention that she had never in all that time found less than extraordinary. "I love you," he said. He said it simply and without decoration, the way he said everything important. "I love you," she said, "every day, without reservation." He reached over and took her hand. The Wyoming sky moved through its colors above them, enormous and ancient and indifferent to everything except the fact that it was here and the land was here, and the people on it were here, living their lives in the brief and irreplaceable time they had. The porch light came on inside. Clara's voice, followed by James's, followed by Robert's persistent and enthusiastic contribution to whatever was being discussed. Eli's footsteps on the back stairs. Anna looked at Bernard. Bernard looked at Anna. They held on. The stars came out over Wyoming all at once and in their millions, and the night received them, and everything that had been built and fought for and held and loved held on in return, solid and warm and real and entirely, completely theirs.